I am Liam. I am 35 years old. For 8 long years, I hid the absolute truth about my life. I hid the fact that I was the sole owner, founder, and chief executive officer of a residential and commercial maintenance empire with a gross annual revenue of nearly $17 million. I kept my mouth shut to keep the peace. I did it because I was foolish enough to believe that my silence was a form of love for my wife. But the night my daughter called me sobbing from a snow-covered porch, everything changed forever. I was miles away, elbow-deep in a burst main water line at a commercial property I owned. While I was risking frostbite to keep a massive building operational, my wife's father deliberately kicked my 16-year-old daughter out into 22-degree weather. They sat inside a beautifully decorated, warm house, laughing and drinking expensive eggnog with 40 other family members, while my little girl shivered in a thin holiday sweater. And my own wife, the woman who was supposed to protect her, did absolutely nothing to stop it. But there was one massive, catastrophic reality that none of those arrogant people sitting around that fireplace knew. They had absolutely no idea that my name was on the legal deed to the very house they were celebrating inside. They had no idea that I personally signed the paychecks for half the men sitting in that living room. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, they were going to lose their jobs, their reputations, and their completely unearned luxury. Before I tell you the exact steps I took to dismantle their lives piece by piece, hit the like button if you believe that nobody should ever get away with harming an innocent child. And please, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment the nightmare began. A night that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. The water flooding the crawl space of the Kellerman Commercial Plaza was black, freezing, and rising incredibly fast. It was Christmas Eve, just past 8 in the evening. The on-call technician, a hardworking guy named Ben, had phoned me in an absolute panic. The main line had ruptured violently, and the fix required an executive judgment call that I needed to make in person. I could have sent a regional manager. I could have stayed home in a warm living room. But the business was built on my own sweat, blood, and tears. I never asked my guys to do something I refused to do myself. I called my wife, Evelyn. She was already over at her parents' massive suburban house with our daughter, Chloe. I explained the emergency. When I told her I would be at least 2 hours late to the family gathering, she let out a sharp, exaggerated breath over the speaker. It was the kind of sigh that vibrated with deep irritation, a sound she always used to make me feel small. She told me to just hurry up and not embarrass her. Then she hung up on me. I drove straight to the commercial property, changed into my heavy canvas work gear, and climbed down into the flooded basement. I was halfway through a massive steel coupling replacement, my hands entirely numb from the icy water, when my phone vibrated violently against my ribs. The screen glowed brightly in the dark, damp space. The caller ID said Chloe. A deep, involuntary panic instantly gripped my chest. My daughter never called twice in a row unless something was horribly wrong. I wiped the thick black grease onto my heavy work jeans and answered the phone. The sound of whipping winter wind completely filled the speaker. Then came the jagged, heavy breathing of someone trying desperately to hold back a full emotional breakdown. "Dad," she gasped, her voice completely broken. "Please come get me. I am outside. It is freezing." I hit my shoulder against a heavy steel support beam as I stood up, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins completely masked the pain. I scrambled out of the crawl space, the freezing water dripping rapidly from my heavy canvas jacket onto the concrete floor. "Chloe, where are you? Tell me exactly what happened right now." "I am on the front porch," she said, her teeth visibly chattering so hard I could hear the clicking through the phone speaker. "Grandpa Richard was making fun of your truck again in front of everyone. He was doing that voice he does, talking about the missing mud flap and your dirty boots. I just told him to stop. I told him it was not funny and that you work hard." She took a sharp, agonizing breath. "He got really mad, Dad. He said I was being incredibly disrespectful in his house. He walked over, opened the front door, and told me to wait outside in the dark until I was ready to come back inside and apologize to him in front of the whole family." My jaw locked so tight my back teeth genuinely ached. I looked up at the temperature gauge mounted on the wall of the utility room. It read 22 degrees Fahrenheit. "Where is your mother, Chloe?" The total silence that followed that question stretched for 3 agonizing, heavy seconds. It was a silence that told me everything I ever needed to know about my marriage. "She said I should just apologize, Dad. She said I was ruining the party." I did not scream. I did not curse. I did not throw my tools against the wall. I walked straight to my old Ford F-250 truck. I told Chloe I was getting in the car right that second and would be there in 20 minutes. I told her to keep the phone pressed to her ear so I could hear her breathing. I drove 90 miles an hour down the icy, dark highway. The anger building inside my chest was not hot or explosive. It was a cold, crystalline rage that settled deep into my bones, a kind of absolute clarity I had never experienced before in my entire life. When I finally pulled onto their pristine, perfectly manicured suburban street, I saw her immediately. Chloe was standing at the far end of the wide brick porch, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, her school backpack thrown onto the frozen concrete at her feet. She looked so small, abandoned by the very people who shared her blood. Through the massive, brightly lit front window of the Sterling family home, I could see the firelight dancing on the walls. I could see Richard standing at the head of the long dining table, a crystal glass of expensive liquor in his hand, holding court and laughing. I saw Evelyn standing near the kitchen island, holding a champagne flute, perfectly comfortable, chatting with her cousins as if her only child was not freezing to death just 20 feet away. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the passenger seat, marched straight up the icy driveway, and wrapped the jacket tightly around my daughter. She buried her face in my chest and shook violently against me. I held her tight for a long moment. Then, I turned my body toward the heavy oak front door. I did not knock. I did not ring the doorbell. I lifted my heavy steel-toed work boot and kicked the door right open. The heavy would hit the inside drywall with a massive crack that sounded exactly like a gunshot. The holiday music playing from the speakers seemed to vanish into thin air. 40 faces turned toward the doorway in dead, terrified silence. Silver forks hovered frozen over porcelain plates. Richard took a sudden step back, spilling a dark splash of scotch onto his expensive Persian rug. I completely ignored all of them. I scanned the massive room, found Chloe's winter coat draped carelessly over a chair near the hallway, and marched over to pick it up. As I turned back toward the door to leave, Evelyn finally materialized from the hallway. She walked toward me with that practiced, smooth confidence she always used when she had a large audience watching her. But she was not holding a warm drink for our daughter. She was holding a thick manila folder bound tightly by a thick rubber band. She walked straight up to me, her eyes completely devoid of any warmth, and slammed the heavy folder against my chest hard enough that I had to grab it to keep it from falling to the floor. "You have embarrassed this family long enough, Liam," she said, her voice perfectly steady and heavily rehearsed. "These are divorce papers. I want you completely out of my house by tomorrow morning." Behind her, Richard stepped forward, a smug, arrogant grin spreading across his wrinkled face. "Tell your loser father to put some gas in his trash truck before it breaks down on the way home," he called out loudly toward the open door where Chloe stood. A few uncles and cousins actually chuckled. I looked at the grown men laughing at a freezing child. I looked at Richard. I looked at Evelyn, the woman I had spent a decade building a life with. I looked down at the divorce papers resting heavily in my dirty hands. I tucked the thick folder securely under my arm. "You are exactly right, Evelyn," I said quietly, making sure my voice carried across the dead silent room. "It is time." I turned my back on the entire room and walked my daughter to the warmth of my truck. They truly thought they had just thrown out a broke, useless handyman. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared a brutal war on the man who secretly held their entire financial future in the palm of his hand. We drove away from that house in total, heavy silence for 20 solid minutes. The heat inside the old truck blasted against the frozen windshield, slowly thawing the thick ice on the glass and the deep chill in my daughter's bones. She pulled her knees up tightly to her chest, staring out the passenger window into the pitch-black night, completely lost in her own thoughts. "Dad," she finally whispered, her voice still trembling. "I am right here, sweetie. I am so sorry I made everything worse tonight." I gripped the worn steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. My own flesh and blood, apologizing for demanding basic human respect from her own grandfather. "You did not make it worse, Chloe," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "You made it better. You made it the truest it has ever been." To fully understand how my family ended up broken and shattered in the cab of an old Ford F-250 on Christmas Eve, you have to understand the incredibly toxic spiderweb I voluntarily walked into 8 years ago. When I first met Evelyn, I was 27 years old. I had just started my company, Whitaker Home Solutions, with $18,000 I had painstakingly saved from working brutal construction jobs, alongside a used van and a contractor's license. By the time Evelyn and I got serious about our relationship, the business was already pulling in highly lucrative commercial contracts. But despite the money sitting in the bank, I still wore heavy work boots. I still drove an old truck because I strongly preferred putting my hard-earned money into quality equipment, paying my employees well, and securing the company's future, rather than wasting it on flashy, depreciating assets. Evelyn came directly from the Sterling family. They were, without a doubt, the absolute worst combination of old money aesthetics and severe new money anxiety. Her father, Richard, had spent 30 mundane years as a middle manager at a logistics firm. He firmly believed that a man's actual worth on this earth was determined entirely by the logo on his car, the brand of his watch, and the zip code on his mortgage. He used the word class as a literal weapon to repeatedly bludgeon anyone he deemed beneath him. The very first time Evelyn brought me to their massive home for a formal dinner, Richard looked slowly down at my calloused hands and then out the window at my missing mud flap. "Handyman," he announced loudly across the dining table. It was not a question. It was a life sentence. Before I could correct him and explain my actual position, Evelyn interjected quickly. "He is a field supervisor, Dad." That was the very first lie, and it slid out of her mouth so effortlessly that I almost missed it entirely. When we finally got back to my car later that night, she took my rough hands gently in hers. She looked up at me with those pleading green eyes that always seemed to melt my resolve. She literally begged me not to tell her parents about the actual business. She told me they were incredibly proud people. She insisted that they would constantly judge the inherent volatility of entrepreneurship, that they would look down on the messy reality of building a company from the ground up. She swore they would never truly accept me if they knew I was a blue-collar business owner rather than a clean, corporate salaried employee. She begged me to just let her handle her family dynamics. I was young, I was deeply in love, and I was incredibly foolish. I wanted nothing more than to give Chloe a stable, loving, two-parent home. So, I took my pride, folded it into a tiny, invisible box, and locked it deeply away. I agreed to play the pathetic role of the struggling, working-class husband. But a lie of that magnitude does not just sit still. It grows over time. It constantly demands to be fed. Here is exactly what 8 miserable years of feeding that lie actually looks like from the inside. You sit quietly through countless Thanksgiving dinners while your arrogant father-in-law makes snide jokes about your meager salary. You watch him buy absurdly expensive golf clubs while making passive-aggressive remarks about how you should probably start a college fund for Chloe early, assuming you can even afford the minimum monthly deposits. Then came the endless hiring requests. It started incredibly small. Evelyn's older brother, Arthur, the undisputed golden boy of the entire Sterling family, lost his prestigious job. He was a lazy marketing associate who spent significantly more time at the local country club than he ever did at his actual office. Evelyn cried for days. She said he was deeply depressed. She pleaded with me, asking if I could just pull some strings with the upper management at my company to get him a simple desk job. Because I secretly controlled the entire company, I literally created a regional procurement position entirely out of thin air. I put Arthur on my payroll at $71,000 a year. He did absolutely nothing but forward emails, take 2-hour lunches, and leave early on Fridays. But it did not stop there. Next came Julian, a distant cousin who desperately needed a fresh start after a bad breakup. Then came Evelyn's uncle, then a close family friend. Year after miserable year, the Sterling family treated my private company like their own personal public charity. Over the course of 8 exhausting years, I quietly placed 47 people with direct or indirect ties to the Sterling family into various administrative and field roles across my 5 regional branches. I paid their massive salaries. I fully funded their 401k matches. I personally approved their generous holiday bonuses. I provided the premium health insurance that paid for their children's braces and their wives' expensive prescriptions. And in return for all of that, they treated me exactly like the hired help at every single family gathering. I let them do it because I honestly thought it kept Evelyn happy. I absorbed the daily humiliation so my daughter could have a massive, seemingly supportive extended family. But sitting in that cheap Marriott Courtyard hotel room that night, listening to Chloe breathe softly from the second queen bed, the entire illusion finally shattered completely. The family I had literally bought, paid for, and sustained had just thrown my child out into the freezing snow for defending my honor. I stood up, walked over to the cheap laminate hotel desk, and turned on the small, flickering lamp. I unclasped the thick rubber band from the manila folder Evelyn had violently shoved into my chest just hours earlier. I spread the thick stack of divorce papers out under the harsh yellow light. I read them not as a heartbroken, betrayed husband, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a chief executive officer. The legal documents were utterly ruthless. They were meticulously drafted by Gregory, a high-profile, notoriously aggressive attorney who specialized almost entirely in high-net-worth asset division. Evelyn was formally seeking full legal custody of Chloe, massive monthly alimony payments, and the absolute deed to our primary home. But the single most glaring detail was intentionally buried deep on page 4 of the petition. The legal document explicitly listed my primary income source as salaried employment at an unnamed residential services company. She did not know the truth. Or, much worse, she did know exactly what I was worth, and she was deliberately lying to the family court to entirely obscure the true value of the marital estate so she could strategically drain our accounts before the formal discovery phase even began. I reached into my battered leather work bag and pulled out my laptop. The bright blue light illuminated the dark, silent room. I connected to the hotel Wi-Fi and securely logged into my company's encrypted main server. I did not feel sad anymore. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal had completely burned away every single ounce of grief I possessed, leaving behind absolutely nothing but cold, terrifying clarity. If they wanted to treat me like a worthless stranger, I was going to show them exactly how a stranger handles a severe threat to his empire. I want to be incredibly clear about what happened next in that dark hotel room. I did not act out of blind, emotional rage. I did not randomly fire people because my personal feelings were hurt or because my ego was bruised. I am a highly successful businessman. I fiercely protect my corporate assets. At exactly midnight, while the rest of the city slept, I launched Aprio on my laptop. It is our enterprise-grade, highly sophisticated internal audit software. We typically used it strictly for standard quarterly compliance reviews, but the system possessed incredibly deep forensic accounting capabilities. I set the software parameters to automatically flag any financial inconsistencies, expense report anomalies, hidden vendor payment mismatches, and irregular fuel charges across the 47 specific employee records connected to the Sterling family over the past 36 full months. I hit the execute command. The green progress bar slowly began creeping across the dark screen. I walked over to the small, cheap hotel coffee maker, brewed a terrible, bitter cup of black coffee, sat back down in the uncomfortable chair, and waited in the silence. Exactly 94 minutes later, the system pinged loudly. The generated report was absolutely devastating. I slowly scrolled through the heavily flagged accounts, the bright glow of the screen reflecting brightly in my eyes. The Sterlings were not just incompetent employees. They were active, calculated thieves. Arthur, the beloved golden boy of the family, had been running a massive, systematic scheme with the company fleet fuel cards. Over a period of 19 consecutive months, he had entirely falsified his corporate mileage logs. He had actively drained exactly $34,200 in unauthorized fuel charges to fill up his own personal vehicles, his wife's car, and his friends' trucks. But it was much worse than just stealing gas. The secure GPS tracking logs on his company-issued luxury SUV showed the vehicle physically parked at a high-end luxury ski resort in Aspen during the exact same week he formally claimed to be conducting critical site inspections in neighboring rural counties. Julian, the distant cousin working comfortably in our accounts receivable department, was significantly worse. He had deliberately set up a dummy vendor email address using a free, untraceable provider. He was running highly sophisticated duplicate invoice submissions on 6 of our largest, most profitable commercial client accounts. He would officially approve the duplicate invoice in the system, stealthily route the secondary payment to a shell LLC he had secretly registered, and pocket the massive difference. His total financial exposure to the company was over $61,000. But the specific detail that made me set my coffee cup down onto the desk with a hard, shaking thud involved Richard himself. My arrogant father-in-law was not officially on my corporate payroll, but his name was plastered all over the forensic audit. Arthur and Julian had collaboratively submitted 12 different, highly expensive corporate entertainment expense reports over the last 2 years. Massive restaurant bills at premium, exclusive steakhouses. A lavish, 5-day weekend stay at a world-class golf resort in Scottsdale, Arizona. 2 separate rounds of golf at a private, members-only club that charged over $400 a single round. Every single one of these fraudulent expenses formally listed Richard Sterling as the prospective client. They were literally using my company's hard-earned money to entirely fund Richard's lavish, luxury lifestyle, all while he stood in my face and repeatedly mocked my worn-out boots and my missing mud flap. By 3:30 in the morning, my eyes were burning, but I had meticulously reviewed all 47 employee files. 33 of the employees were completely clean. They were just regular, decent people showing up and doing their jobs who simply happened to share a last name or a loose family connection. I carefully separated their files into a secure folder. I had absolutely no intention of punishing innocent, hard-working people for the disgusting sins of their greedy relatives. But 14 of them had incredibly documented, completely undeniable financial irregularities. Gross fraud, calculated embezzlement, direct theft of corporate funds. I meticulously compiled every single receipt, every single GPS log, and every single fake invoice. I securely time-stamped the entire massive data packet, heavily encrypted it, and locked it permanently into the company's secure, off-site server where no one could delete it. Then, I picked up my cell phone. It was exactly 3:47 a.m. I scrolled slowly through my contact list and pressed call on the direct number for Thomas, my personal corporate attorney. Thomas is 62 years old. He has the weary, heavily lined face of a tired bloodhound and a legal mind exactly like a steel trap. He has aggressively represented my company since 2014, and he is easily the most terrifying, ruthless man in a courtroom I have ever witnessed. He answered the phone on the 3rd ring. Liam. His voice was rough with sleep, but immediately alert. Is someone dead or in jail? Neither, Thomas, I replied, staring at the dark wall. But the landscape has entirely changed tonight. I laid absolutely everything out for him. I told him the entire truth about the 8 miserable years of silence. I vividly detailed the divorce papers being served in front of a massive audience of laughing relatives. I told him about Chloe standing freezing in the snow. And then, I walked him step by step through the exact, damning numbers of the midnight forensic audit. Thomas did not interrupt me once. He listened with the chilling, absolute focus of a predator catching the scent of blood. When I finally finished speaking, the line was completely quiet for 11 full seconds. I literally counted them in my head. All right, Thomas finally said, his voice completely awake and incredibly sharp. Here is exactly how we dismantle them. Step 1. We file an emergency motion at the county courthouse the exact second the doors open to legally separate your corporate assets from any potential marital property claims. She desperately wants the house. The deed to that property is held securely by one of your LLCs. The mortgage is paid directly by the company. Evelyn's name is nowhere on that title. We are sending her a formal 30-day notice of eviction by armed courier. I nodded slowly in the dark room, even though he could not see me. And step 2. Step 2 is the absolute bloodbath, Thomas said flatly. Your HR director formally issues immediate termination letters to all 14 employees implicated in the audit. We will directly reference specific corporate policy violations. We will make it completely legally bulletproof. As for Arthur and Julian, we do not just fire them. I am bringing in Elena, our top forensic accountant. We are handing their files directly to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. Embezzlement over $50,000 carries serious, mandatory jail time. Evelyn is going to demand half the company, I said, looking down at the divorce petition. She hired Gregory. He's a massive shark in family court. Thomas let out a low, incredibly dry chuckle. Gregory is a tiny shark in a very small fish tank. He has absolutely never dealt with a corporate structure like yours. I want you to go into the executive office tomorrow morning. Liam, put on a tailored suit. Act exactly like the CEO you are. Let me handle the legal paperwork. By lunchtime, they will realize they brought a butter knife to a drone strike. I finally hung up the phone. I walked over to the hotel window and looked out at the dark, empty highway. I genuinely thought the worst was finally over. I thought the audit was the deepest cut they had inflicted. I was so incredibly wrong. The real, crushing betrayal was still hiding quietly in the shadows, just waiting for the sun to come up. I managed to sleep for exactly 2 fitful hours. When I finally woke up, the freezing winter sun was just starting to slowly break over the distant horizon, casting a harsh, pale, unforgiving light over the frozen hotel parking lot. Chloe was still fast asleep, completely exhausted, wrapped tightly in the heavy hotel blankets. I quietly wrote a loving note and left it on the small nightstand alongside a crisp $50 bill for room service. I specifically instructed her to lock the heavy door securely, order whatever she wanted, and watch movies until I returned. I always kept a spare, high-quality suit in the back of my truck for unexpected, high-level investor meetings. It wasn't anything incredibly flashy or obnoxious, just a sharply tailored, dark navy blue suit and a perfectly crisp white dress shirt. I quickly changed in the cramped hotel bathroom, violently splashed freezing cold water onto my tired face, and stared deeply at my reflection in the mirror. The quiet, exhausted, accommodating handyman was entirely gone. I drove straight to the massive glass facade headquarters of Whitaker Home Solutions located directly on Harrington Drive. I swiped my executive keycard, walked confidently past the massive marble reception desk, and took the private, secure elevator all the way up to the top floor. My expansive corner office featured floor-to-ceiling windows looking entirely out over the sprawling city skyline. I sat down heavily in the massive leather executive chair, booted up my high-powered desktop computer, and drank a steaming cup of premium coffee that actually cost real money. At exactly 8:45 a.m., my heavy office door opened quietly. Marcus, my brilliant director of human resources, walked into the room. Marcus was a highly disciplined former military logistics officer. He was incredibly precise, rarely smiled, and was fiercely, undeniably loyal to me and the company. He walked over and deliberately placed a thick stack of 14 heavy folders directly onto my mahogany desk. The termination packets are fully finalized, Liam, Marcus said, his posture perfectly straight, his tone completely professional. I spent the morning reviewing the raw audit data you sent over. It is completely airtight. We have them entirely dead to rights. I have already formally revoked their physical building access, permanently disabled all of their company emails, and completely frozen their corporate expense credit cards. The generous severance packages for the 33 completely innocent employees are fully prepped for distribution later this week. Send the 14 formal termination emails at exactly 9 o'clock. I instructed, my voice deadly calm. Do not, under any circumstances, answer any of their frantic follow-up emails. Forward all incoming communications directly to Thomas at the law firm. Marcus nodded once, sharply. Understood completely. He turned on his heel and walked out of the office. I sat alone in the massive silence of my office. The red digital clock on my desk clicked steadily forward. 8:58 a.m. 8:59 a.m. 9 a.m. Somewhere out there in the sprawling city, 14 different cell phones and laptops simultaneously received an automated, legally binding email directly from the HR department, detailing their immediate, unceremonious termination for gross financial misconduct. I leaned far back into my comfortable leather chair and simply waited. I knew exactly who would be the very first person to call. At exactly 9:04 a.m., my cell phone vibrated violently against the hard mahogany desk. The bright caller ID flashed Richard's name. He must have been standing directly next to Arthur inside their massive house when the devastating email hit his phone. I deliberately let the phone ring 3 full times. Then, I calmly picked it up and pressed the cool glass to my ear. Liam. Richard's voice was incredibly loud, vibrating heavily with a disgusting mixture of forced, fake warmth and underlying, arrogant rage. It was the exact tone of an entitled man completely used to bullying helpless customer service representatives into complete submission. Listen to me very carefully right now. Some absolute, complete idiot in your HR department just mistakenly sent termination letters to Arthur, Julian, and half the damn family. I don't know what kind of absolute circus you people are running over there, but you need to give me your boss's direct phone number right this second so I can get this mess straightened out and get that HR rep fired. I looked out the massive window at the tiny morning traffic moving slowly far below my tower. I let the total silence stretch heavily over the line. I let him hear absolutely nothing but the quiet, expensive hum of the corporate air conditioning. You are already speaking to him, Richard? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What? The sheer confusion in his booming voice was instantly palpable. Don't play stupid games with me right now, Liam. Just give me the damn management number. Whitaker Home Solutions, I said, my voice dropping to a dead, flat, terrifying calm. Whitaker, as in Liam Whitaker, the absolute founder, the sole owner, the chief executive officer. I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath on the other end of the line. It was the distinct sound of a man's entire arrogant worldview violently collapsing in real time. That's completely impossible, Richard stammered, the arrogant, bullying bluster draining from his throat instantly, leaving behind a weak, trembling old man. You drive a beat-up truck. You fix dirty pipes in basements. I own the million-dollar buildings those dirty pipes are inside of, Richard. I sharply corrected him. And as of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, the internal audit has formally concluded. The extensive forensic documentation regarding Arthur's massive fuel fraud, Julian's fake shell invoices, and your highly personal, luxurious golf trips entirely paid for by my company have been totally secured. The files are currently sitting on the desk of the district attorney. You will be receiving formal correspondence from my legal team regarding a massive civil lawsuit for the stolen funds by the absolute end of the business day. Liam, please wait. You need to let's just talk about this like men. Furthermore, I cut him off, the absolute authority in my voice leaving absolutely no room for any negotiation or debate. The formal legal eviction notice for the massive property at 14 Ashwood Lane has already been formally served to Evelyn. My company completely owns the deed to that house. She has exactly 30 days to entirely vacate the premises before the sheriffs arrive. Liam, you absolutely cannot do this to your family. Richard's voice completely cracked. He was practically begging through the phone. The mighty, arrogant patriarch instantly reduced to pathetic pleading. Family does not deliberately leave a 16-year-old girl freezing in the snow, Richard. I replied softly, my tone absolute ice. Merry Christmas. I ended the call immediately and permanently blocked his number. Within 60 seconds, my phone screen lit up wildly like a broken slot machine. The notifications stacked incredibly rapidly. 12, 20, 30 missed calls and frantic, desperate text messages flooding in from Evelyn, from a panicked Arthur, from terrified cousins and uncles who suddenly realized the massive bank vault had just been slammed violently shut on their greedy fingers. I turned the phone firmly face down onto the desk. The absolute silence in my office was beautiful. It was the undeniable sound of total, absolute control. But just as I confidently reached for my computer mouse to review the morning's real estate profit reports, my private desk phoned the direct, highly unlisted secure line that only top-level executives knew about rang sharply. I picked up the heavy receiver. "Liam Whitaker speaking." "Mr. Whitaker," a woman's voice said. She sounded absolutely terrified, her breath hitching nervously. "My name is Sarah. I was a senior paralegal at Gregory's law firm. I formally resigned 2 weeks ago." I frowned deeply, sitting straight up in my chair. "Why exactly are you calling me on this private line, Sarah? Because you desperately need to know what your wife actually did?" She whispered rapidly, as if someone dangerous were actively listening to her. "She didn't just start planning this divorce yesterday, and the money her family embezzled from your company. That's not even the worst of it. I have the highly confidential documents, Mr. Whitaker. I know exactly where she hid the real money." I gripped the heavy phone receiver so tightly my hand ached. The real, catastrophic storm had not even started. I sat completely frozen in my massive executive office, gripping the heavy black receiver of my private desk phone so tightly that the plastic groaned under the pressure of my fingers. My mind raced violently, desperately trying to process the absolute magnitude of what the terrified woman on the other end of the secure line was actually saying. Sarah, the senior paralegal from Gregory's high-end, incredibly expensive downtown law firm, had just completely blown the heavy steel lid off a massive, coordinated financial conspiracy that I had never even suspected in my wildest nightmares. I told her to meet me in exactly 45 minutes at a small, heavily outdated, independent diner located on the far industrial outskirts of the city. I specifically chose a location miles away from the towering corporate downtown area where the Sterling family and their high-priced lawyers liked to pretend they held absolute power. I hung up the phone, grabbed my heavy winter coat off the hook behind my door, and walked quickly past Marcus in the quiet, carpeted hallway. I strictly instructed him to hold all of my morning calls, cancel my afternoon real estate portfolio review, and lock down my office. I took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage, climbed into the freezing cab of my old Ford F-250, and drove aggressively through the heavy, sluggish morning traffic. My mind was completely consumed by the massive, life-altering implications of Sarah's frantic words. If what she was saying was actually true, Evelyn had not just betrayed me emotionally. She had actively committed a massive, highly calculated felony. When I finally pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the diner, the freezing winter wind was howling viciously off the nearby highway. The diner itself was mostly empty, smelling strongly of burnt filter coffee, old frying grease, and lemon bleach. I spotted Sarah immediately. She was sitting rigidly in a dark, secluded back corner booth. She was a woman in her mid-40s, wearing a simple beige trench coat, looking incredibly exhausted and deeply, genuinely paranoid. She clutched a thick, worn leather messenger bag tightly against her chest like it was a physical shield protecting her from the world. I walked over slowly, making sure not to startle her, and slid quietly into the cracked, red vinyl booth directly across from her. She did not waste a single precious second on polite pleasantries. She immediately unzipped her heavy leather bag and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of highly confidential photocopied legal and financial documents. She slid them carefully across the sticky diner table toward me, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door. "I want you to know that I am absolutely not doing this for money, Mr. Whitaker," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly but her dark eyes locked directly and firmly onto mine. "I formally resigned from that prestigious firm 2 weeks ago because Gregory specifically asked me to formally notarize a financial disclosure document that I knew was a complete, deliberate, fabricated lie. I have been sitting inside my apartment with this agonizing, suffocating guilt for 14 days, trying desperately to decide if I owed a total stranger the absolute truth. But when I heard the office gossip this morning about what happened to your teenage daughter out in the snow last night, I knew I had to speak up. I am a mother too. What your wife did is unforgivable. I nodded slowly, appreciating her immense courage, and opened the thick manila file. The very first page was a standard law firm consultation intake form. I looked closely at the date stamped boldly in black ink at the very top right corner. It was January 14th, 2023. Evelyn had not decided to suddenly hand me divorce papers on a sudden, highly emotional whim on Christmas Eve. She had been actively, meticulously, and coldly planning to completely destroy our 8-year marriage for 14 full months. Every single time she kissed me, every time we sat together at Thanksgiving dinners, every time she smiled at me across the living room, she was actively plotting my total financial ruin. I felt a cold, clammy sweat break out on the back of my neck as I began flipping rapidly through the dense pages of the file. Sarah reached across the table and pointed a trembling finger to a specific series of heavily highlighted bank statements. Your wife came to Gregory's office over a year ago with a highly specific, incredibly malicious goal, Sarah explained quietly, leaning closer to ensure no one else could hear. She handed the firm highly confidential, internal documentation about your company, corporate tax filings, estimated gross business valuations, complete commercial real estate asset listings. She knew exactly what Whitaker Home Solutions was actually worth, Mr. Whitaker. She knew you were the sole, undisputed owner. But she explicitly asked Gregory to formally advise her on how to legally structure the impending divorce so that the company's true, massive financial value would be completely obscured and entirely hidden during the initial family court asset discovery phase. I stared down at a specific, highly detailed bank transfer log, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. She was artificially and deliberately deflating the visual financial picture of your joint marital estate, Sarah continued, her tone strictly professional but laced with obvious disgust. If she could successfully convince the court to officially characterize your massive income as a standard mid-level corporate salary rather than outright multimillion-dollar executive ownership, it would forcefully trap you into a massive, protracted legal disclosure process that could easily take 18 months to untangle. In the meantime, while you were buried in paperwork, she was quietly and systematically siphoning off the real, liquid cash assets. I looked closely at the specific numbers on the page. The reality was absolutely sickening. Over the past 14 months, Evelyn had systematically and deliberately moved exactly $340,000 directly from our joint marital savings accounts. That stolen money included the massive initial deposits I had painfully saved for Chloe's university college fund. Evelyn had falsely categorized every single one of those transfers under the clever guise of massive household maintenance expenses, luxury home renovations that simply never happened, and completely fake, highly expensive medical bills. The bank transfers were perfectly, flawlessly timed and strategically structured just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. This was a highly calculated move designed specifically to completely avoid triggering any automatic Internal Revenue Service fraud flags or mandatory bank reporting requirements. She took all of that hard-earned money and quietly moved it into an entirely secret, highly secured offshore-style brokerage account registered exclusively under her maiden name, Evelyn Sterling, at a completely different financial institution located across the county line. She had literally stolen my daughter's entire educational future, secured her own lavish financial independence, and then stood confidently in her parents' warm living room playing the righteous, abused victim while her father threw my child into the freezing winter snow. I looked up from the documents and stared directly at Sarah. Are you absolutely, unconditionally willing to sign a sworn, legally binding affidavit confirming everything you just told me today, including Gregory's direct, unethical involvement in actively advising her to hide these massive marital assets? Sarah swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing, but she nodded her head firmly without a single second of hesitation. Yes, I will absolutely testify in family court under oath if I have to. What they are actively doing is a complete, undeniable violation of legal ethics, and it is just plain evil. I genuinely thanked her, paid for her coffee, and immediately drove the physical documents straight to Thomas's downtown law office. When I walked furiously into his private executive suite and threw the massive, damming file directly onto his pristine desk. Thomas immediately picked up his phone and called Elena into the room. Elena was his law firm's absolute top, undisputed forensic accountant. She held a CPA, a highly difficult CFE certification, and possessed 15 brutal, incredibly successful years of experience actively testifying in high-net-worth financial fraud cases. Elena took the heavy file, adjusted her reading glasses, and spent exactly 10 minutes in total, absolute silence reviewing the complex transfer logs. She finally looked up at me with the cold, flat, entirely emotionless expression of a trauma surgeon about to perform a necessary amputation. This is deliberate, textbook asset dissipation occurring in direct anticipation of divorce proceedings, Elena stated firmly, tapping the paper with her pen. It is a massive, undeniable felony. Give me exactly 48 hours to pull the complete digital banking records, trace the hidden routing numbers, and draft a legally bulletproof, 43-page formal forensic report. While Elena worked tirelessly and quietly in the background, the Sterling family was completely, publicly imploding in the foreground. By Wednesday afternoon, Gregory's prestigious law firm formally reached out to Thomas via urgent email. They officially requested an immediate, emergency in-person mediation meeting to discuss the unfortunate, highly emotional events of the holiday weekend. Gregory and Evelyn genuinely, truly believed they still held the absolute upper hand in this massive war. They arrogantly thought I was just an angry, heartbroken, blue-collar husband fiercely lashing out by hastily firing her family members. They foolishly assumed I was entirely desperate to settle the messy situation quickly to protect my supposedly fragile, struggling company from a massive public relations scandal. They wanted to aggressively corner me in a fancy conference room, highly leverage the impending divorce papers, and force me into legally signing away half of my entire life before I even had a chance to consult a real financial advisor. Thomas looked at the urgent email request from Gregory on his computer monitor, leaned far back into his expensive leather chair, and smiled a completely terrifying, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. Accept the meeting immediately, Thomas instructed his assistant over the intercom. Tell them we will meet them directly at their office on Friday morning at exactly 10 o'clock sharp. The trap was completely, perfectly set. Evelyn was happily walking directly into a brutal legal slaughterhouse, fueled entirely by her own blinding arrogance and the profound, deeply misplaced confidence of a toxic family that had absolutely never faced a single real consequence in their entire miserable lives. I went back home to my newly rented, highly secure townhouse, made a hot dinner for Chloe, and waited patiently for Friday morning to finally arrive. Friday morning was bitterly, aggressively cold, featuring the kind of deep, unforgiving winter chill that physically bites right through your heavy clothing and settles directly into your bones. I woke up early, completely focused and entirely devoid of any lingering anxiety. I wore my absolute best, custom-tailored dark navy suit, completely abandoning the rugged canvas work jackets, worn-out denim jeans, and heavy steel-toed boots that Evelyn had always so openly despised. I was no longer playing the convenient role of the quiet, accommodating handyman. I was the chief executive officer of a multimillion-dollar corporation, and I was absolutely dressed for war. I walked confidently into the massive, incredibly intimidating glass and steel lobby of Gregory's downtown law firm alongside Thomas and Elena. We did not speak a single word to each other in the sleek, mirrored elevator as it rapidly ascended to the top floor. We absolutely did not need to. The impending legal execution was already perfectly, flawlessly choreographed down to the very last second. A young, highly polished receptionist immediately escorted us down a long hallway lined with expensive modern art and led us into a massive, heavily soundproofed corner conference room. The room featured a ridiculously large, custom-built mahogany table that dominated the entire space. Gregory was already sitting comfortably at the absolute head of the table, wearing a completely arrogant, highly condescending smirk on his face. Evelyn sat directly next to him. She was wearing a very plain, completely conservative, dull gray dress. She wore absolutely no makeup and had her hair pulled back simply. She was deliberately, methodically trying to look like the completely exhausted, financially vulnerable, severely victimized housewife. It was a brilliant, highly calculated performance designed specifically to manipulate the legal system. When I confidently walked through the heavy, solid oak doors, Evelyn did not even bother to look at me. She kept her green eyes firmly fixed downward onto her yellow legal notepad, playing her assigned role of the terrified spouse perfectly. We sat down quietly on the completely opposite side of the massive wooden table. Gregory did not waste any time with standard professional pleasantries. He immediately opened his incredibly thick, premium leather binder, leaned far forward across the table, and laced his fingers together in a classic, incredibly transparent posture of manufactured legal dominance. "Gentlemen," Gregory began, his loud voice dripping with absolute, sickening condescension. "Let us be perfectly crystal clear about exactly why we are all gathered here today. Your deeply emotional client, Mr. Whitaker, has engaged in highly retaliatory, deeply unprofessional, and completely illegal behavior by unlawfully terminating 14 innocent members of my client's extended family simply because she bravely chose to formally file for a legally justified divorce. We are fully prepared to immediately file a massive, highly public civil lawsuit for wrongful termination, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and workplace harassment unless we can successfully reach a highly comprehensive, incredibly favorable settlement right here, today." Thomas sat perfectly still. He did not even reach out to touch his battered leather briefcase resting on the table. He simply looked at Gregory with a blank expression, as if he were observing a fascinating, deeply unintelligent insect crawling across the polished mahogany wood. Gregory incorrectly took Thomas's absolute silence as a clear sign of weakness and pressed forward even more aggressively. "Our formal settlement demands are completely, absolutely non-negotiable," Gregory stated loudly, tapping his expensive pen against the table for emphasis. "Evelyn formally receives full, undisputed primary custody of Chloe, with extremely limited, highly supervised visitation for your client. She receives the absolute, clear deed to the residential property currently located at 14 Ashwood Lane. She receives exactly 60% of the total liquid marital assets. Furthermore, based entirely on Mr. Whitaker's formally declared corporate salary and subsequent expected future earnings, we are aggressively demanding exactly $10,000 a month in permanent, non-modifiable spousal alimony. If you completely agree to sign these terms right now, we will generously formally drop the wrongful termination civil lawsuit and keep this entire messy, highly embarrassing situation entirely out of the public family court records." The resulting silence in the massive, soundproofed conference room was completely, utterly deafening. Evelyn finally looked up from her yellow notepad. A tiny, highly victorious, sickeningly smug smile began playing softly on the absolute corners of her mouth. She genuinely, truly thought she had completely won. She thought she had successfully, brilliantly backed the poor, stupid, uneducated handyman into a completely inescapable legal corner. Thomas slowly, deliberately reached down to his worn leather briefcase. He slowly clicked the heavy brass locks open. The sharp metallic sound echoed incredibly loudly in the perfectly quiet room. He methodically pulled out 3 incredibly thick, beautifully bound, highly detailed document folders and slid them incredibly smoothly across the highly polished mahogany table directly toward Gregory. "What exactly is this supposed to be?" Gregory asked, frowning deeply in clear annoyance as he looked down at the heavy stacks of paper. "That is stark reality, Gregory," Thomas said, his voice a low, terrifying, rumbling baritone, "because the completely fabricated fantasy you and your fraudulent client have been happily living in just officially, permanently ended." Thomas pointed a long, bony finger directly at the very first folder. "Exhibit A is a fully certified, legally binding, 43-page forensic accounting report expertly prepared by Ms. Elena here. It meticulously, undeniably details exactly how your client, Evelyn, systematically, continuously, and deliberately siphoned exactly $340,000 of joint marital funds. This massive theft specifically includes draining her own daughter's designated university college fund. She deliberately moved these stolen funds into a hidden, entirely undisclosed offshore-style brokerage account registered strictly under her maiden name, actively utilizing structured transactions to completely bypass standard federal IRS reporting thresholds. Evelyn's face instantly drained of absolutely all color. Her jaw literally dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock. The smug, highly victorious smile vanished so incredibly fast it looked like it was violently, physically ripped right off her face. Exhibit B. Thomas continued relentlessly, his authoritative voice rising significantly in volume and absolute, terrifying authority. Is a highly detailed, deeply sworn legal affidavit from a woman named Sarah, who until very recently served loyally as your own senior paralegal. In this heavily sworn, notarized affidavit, Sarah explicitly testifies under penalty of perjury that Evelyn formally consulted this exact law firm 14 full months ago. Furthermore, she officially testifies that you, Gregory, actively, knowingly advised Evelyn to deliberately obscure the true corporate valuation of Whitaker Home Solutions to illegally secure a vastly unfair, highly fraudulent financial advantage in family court. Gregory physically recoiled away from the massive table as if the legal documents had suddenly caught fire. His arrogant, dominant posture collapsed entirely. His eyes darted wildly and frantically between the highly damning papers and Thomas's completely unyielding, stone-cold face. And finally, we have Exhibit C. Thomas finished powerfully, leaning heavily onto the wooden table and glaring directly, aggressively into Gregory's terrified eyes. This is the complete, totally unredacted internal corporate forensic audit formally conducted by Whitaker Home Solutions. It unequivocally, factually proves, utilizing absolute GPS vehicle tracking and fully verified digital vendor receipts, that Arthur Sterling and Julian Sterling actively, maliciously embezzled nearly $100,000 directly from my client's private company. Those comprehensive files were officially, formally handed directly over to the county district attorney at exactly 8 o'clock this morning for immediate, highly aggressive criminal prosecution. I sat back and watched Evelyn incredibly closely. She was physically, visibly trembling in her expensive chair. She looked frantically, desperately over at her high-priced, arrogant lawyer, fully expecting him to aggressively fight back, expecting him to magically deploy some brilliant legal loophole to fix the absolute, catastrophic disaster she had entirely created. But Gregory absolutely did not fight back. Gregory was a selfish man who deeply valued his lucrative legal license and his personal freedom entirely above his paying clients. Gregory stared directly at the sworn affidavit from his former paralegal. He knew exactly, precisely what that single document meant. It was absolute, undeniable proof of a massive ethical violation, active corporate conspiracy to commit severe financial fraud, and a direct, highly credible threat of total professional disbarment and potential federal jail time. Without saying a single comforting word to his client, Gregory abruptly stood up forcefully from his heavy leather chair. He forcefully slammed his expensive binder shut, his hands shaking noticeably in pure panic. I am officially, formally withdrawing as legal counsel for Evelyn Sterling. Effective immediately, Gregory announced loudly, his voice completely tight with pure, undeniable terror. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this hidden, illegal brokerage account, and I completely, unequivocally deny any involvement whatsoever in actively advising this particular client to hide massive marital assets from the court. Gregory, what on earth are you doing? Evelyn shrieked loudly, the carefully crafted, quiet victim persona completely shattering into absolute, pathetic desperation. You cannot just leave me sitting here. You absolutely promised me we would win. You completely lied to me, Evelyn. Gregory snapped viciously, grabbing his expensive briefcase and backing quickly, desperately away from the massive table. You maliciously used my prestigious firm to commit massive, undeniable fraud. Do not ever contact this office again. Gregory practically sprinted out of the heavy conference room doors, leaving Evelyn sitting completely, utterly alone on her side of the expansive mahogany table. She slowly looked across the expansive wood directly at me. Her green eyes were completely wide with sheer, unadulterated, absolute terror. The incredibly arrogant, previously untouchable sterling princess suddenly realized she was completely exposed, entirely broke, and actively facing potential, severe criminal charges of her own. "Liam, please," she whispered, her voice breaking pathetically into a sob. "Please, we can fix this. I am your wife. We have a family together." "We do not have a family, Evelyn," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly cold and absolute. "You have a family, and as of this morning, they are all entirely unemployed, completely broke, and actively facing serious state prison time. The formal eviction sheriffs will be at the Ashwood Lane property bright and early on Monday morning to physically remove you and your belongings from my house. You will communicate with me exclusively through Thomas regarding the swift finalization of this divorce and my absolute, sole, undisputed custody of Chloe." I stood up slowly, calmly buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked purposefully out of the room without ever looking back at her again. The absolute destruction of her empire was completely finalized. The immense, devastating fallout from that Friday morning mediation meeting was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Once the massive dominoes finally started falling, there was absolutely nothing the arrogant Sterling family could do to stop the complete, highly public collapse of their entirely unearned privilege. Arthur and Julian, the previously untouchable golden boys of the family, were formally indicted by the county grand jury in late February. The highly aggressive district attorney did not offer them a single, lenient plea deal. The forensic evidence provided by Elena was entirely too strong, the corporate GPS logs too precise, and the highly detailed fake invoice trails completely undeniable in the eyes of the law. Both men were forcefully required to hire incredibly expensive, high-profile criminal defense attorneys they absolutely could not afford, severely draining whatever meager retirement savings their parents had left in their accounts. The last time I heard anything concrete about Arthur, the former arrogant golden boy was actively, desperately negotiating a harsh plea agreement that involved massive, crippling financial restitution and guaranteed, mandatory jail time just to actively avoid a much longer, decades-long prison sentence. Evelyn's entire, carefully constructed luxury life simply evaporated into thin air overnight, because she had actively, maliciously engaged in proven, calculated financial fraud and deliberate asset dissipation. The presiding family court judge was absolutely furious with her deceitful behavior. The judge immediately and aggressively struck down her completely ridiculous demands for massive spousal alimony. She was formally, legally ordered to entirely return the stolen $340,000 directly back into the protected marital estate, heavily penalizing her final legal settlement in the process. Because the Ashwood Lane house was strictly, legally owned by my corporate LLC, the eviction notice stood perfectly firm. Evelyn was forcefully required to frantically pack all of her incredibly expensive designer clothes, luxury shoes, and premium handbags into cheap, brown cardboard boxes and move directly back into her tiny childhood bedroom at Richard and Beatrice's house. She had absolutely no job, no leverage, no influence, and absolutely no access to the massive corporate wealth she had spent 14 long, deceitful months trying to illegally steal. But I want to be entirely honest about something extremely important with all of you watching this. This story could very easily become just about the dark, highly satisfying joy of watching terrible, arrogant people completely fall apart. But if I only focused on the sweet revenge, I would be exactly as bitter, toxic, and classist as they were. Not everyone associated with that massive extended family was a terrible monster. The 33 completely innocent employees I terminated strictly for having a loose family connection, the ones who had completely clean, flawless corporate audit records, all received incredibly generous, massive severance packages. I personally provided every single one of them with glowing, highly positive professional references to help them transition smoothly. A few short weeks after the massive corporate firing, I received a quiet, unexpected phone call from a young woman named Maya. She was a brilliant, incredibly hardworking project manager who had been with my company for 4 highly productive years. Her only crime in this entire situation was simply being Richard's distant niece. "Mr. Whitaker," Maya said, her voice completely calm, respectful, and entirely professional over the phone. "I just wanted to call and personally thank you. I successfully used your strong, highly detailed letter of recommendation to secure a massive executive promotion at a competing commercial real estate firm. I completely understand why you absolutely had to clear the board and protect your assets. I bear absolutely no anger or resentment toward you. The Sterling side of the family has always been completely toxic, manipulative, and arrogant, and you were completely right to protect your company from them. That short, highly professional phone call honestly meant more to me than almost anything else during that entire chaotic, incredibly stressful month. It actively proved to my own soul that I had not entirely lost my fundamental humanity in the brutal pursuit of absolute justice. I was still fully capable of recognizing and directly supporting good, hard-working people. Then, there was the final, incredibly pathetic phone call from Richard. It happened on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning in early March. I honestly do not know exactly how he managed to get his hands on a private number that was not permanently blocked by my corporate phone system. Perhaps he used a cheap, disposable burner phone from a local gas station. He called my direct line and left a long, highly rambling voicemail. I sat alone at my massive executive desk, put the phone on loudspeaker, and listened to it exactly once. He sounded incredibly old, severely defeated, and much quieter than I had ever heard him speak in 8 miserable years. He sounded exactly like a completely broken man who had confidently, arrogantly walked into a massive room he thought he absolutely owned, only to suddenly, violently realize the heavy walls belonged entirely to someone else. Liam. Richard's voice crackled softly and weakly through the high-end speaker. I want you to know that I truly did not realize the actual massive truth about your company. I had absolutely no idea about who you really were, about your massive, incredible success. I would really like to formally, sincerely apologize for the terrible, unforgivable things I have said over the years, to you and especially to my granddaughter Chloe. He paused for a very long, incredibly heavy time, taking a highly shaky, nervous breath. I just didn't know you were the CEO. If I had known, things would have been completely different. I would have respected you. He genuinely, truly meant that last part as a legitimate explanation, perhaps even as a partial, completely acceptable excuse for his decades of terrible, arrogant behavior. But as I sat there quietly listening to the digital recording, I realized it was the ultimate, undeniable proof of his deeply rotten, completely corrupted core. He was not actually apologizing because he felt genuine, deep remorse for being incredibly cruel to a hard-working, loving son-in-law. He was not apologizing because he realized that deliberately throwing a 16-year-old girl into the freezing snow was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. He was only apologizing because he finally realized I was incredibly wealthy. In his deeply twisted, highly classist mind, he genuinely believed he had complete, absolute justification for treating me like absolute garbage simply because he assumed I was poor. The only thing my massive bank account changed in his pathetic eyes was whether or not he finally had to face severe, undeniable, catastrophic consequences for his cruelty. I did not call him back. I did not yell at him. I simply reached forward, pressed the delete button on the digital voicemail interface, and permanently erased his voice from my life forever. It was the absolute truest, most powerful response I could possibly give him. Complete and total erasure. It is late summer now, many long, incredibly healing months since that freezing, highly traumatic Christmas Eve that completely shattered our lives. The heavy, intensely suffocating weight of the Sterling family's constant, toxic judgment has entirely lifted from my weary shoulders, and the pure, unadulterated peace that has finally settled deeply into my new home is absolutely incredible. Chloe officially finished her highly demanding sophomore year of high school with a massive, incredibly impressive 3.8 GPA. But vastly more importantly than her stellar academic grades, she finally found her own powerful, undeniable voice. She completely refused to let the severe trauma of her mother's massive betrayal negatively define her bright future. Instead of spending her entire summer lounging lazily around the house or aggressively demanding expensive, luxurious vacations, she deliberately went out and got a highly demanding, physical part-time job working for a local commercial landscaping company. It was entirely her own personal choice, not mine. Every single day, she comes home with real dirt deeply embedded under her fingernails, completely exhausted but incredibly, fiercely proud of the hard work she accomplished. I strongly suspect she is actively, consciously building her own personal story about what it truly means to earn things legitimately from the ground up, to deeply respect honest, hard labor, and to absolutely never judge a person by the amount of mud on their heavy work boots. We eat a quiet, peaceful dinner together every single night. We talk openly, honestly, and deeply, without me ever having to perform a heavily filtered, completely fake version of myself for an arrogant audience that never truly deserved my presence. Whitaker Home Solutions completely survived the massive, sudden personnel purge. In fact, without the heavy, incredibly toxic dead weight of the Sterling family severely dragging down our operational efficiency and constantly, greedily draining our corporate resources, the company experienced its absolute best first quarter in our entire corporate history. We currently have over $12 million in completely new, highly lucrative commercial contracts actively sitting in the confirmed pipeline. Marcus, my fiercely loyal, highly competent director of human resources, received a massive, highly deserved executive promotion. He joyfully used a large portion of his substantial salary raise to take his entire family on a beautiful 3-week luxury vacation to Portugal, which is absolutely the best, most satisfying thing I have facilitated in a very long time. As for me, the sharp, custom-tailored navy suit is currently hanging quietly in my massive closet. I wore it proudly to the annual January corporate board meeting, and I will absolutely wear it again to the next formal executive gathering. But on most regular, everyday occasions, I simply wear whatever I feel completely comfortable in. Just last week, I had a massive, highly important introductory meeting with a completely new commercial property management group. We were aggressively negotiating a massive maintenance contract that represented 7 figures in potential annual recurring revenue. I did not take a black, flashy luxury sedan to the meeting. I drove my old, incredibly reliable, battered Ford F-250 directly to their massive corporate headquarters. As I confidently climbed out of the heavy truck, wearing clean, simple work jeans and a basic button-down shirt, their highly respected CEO, a man named Mr. Harrison, walked directly out to the exclusive executive parking lot to personally greet me. Mr. Harrison stopped and looked very closely at my battered, highly used truck. He looked at it with the exact same expression people use when they spot a highly reliable, incredibly sturdy piece of classic, enduring machinery. It was a look of pure, unadulterated, deep respect. "That is a really good, incredibly solid truck, Liam," Mr. Harrison said, nodding approvingly at the heavy, scratched steel frame. "She runs perfectly when it absolutely matters the most," I replied, smiling genuinely. We shook hands firmly, walked inside his massive building, and successfully closed the $1 million deal in less than a single hour. When I finally drove home later that afternoon, I rolled the heavy windows all the way down. The warm, beautiful late summer air rushed violently into the cab, blowing away the absolute last lingering shadows of the past 8 toxic years. I looked closely in the side mirror. The plastic mud flap on the passenger side is still completely missing. I keep meaning to formally take the truck into the auto shop to finally get it fixed. But honestly, I think I am going to just leave it exactly the way it is. It is a constant, incredibly powerful, daily reminder that absolute perfection is a total, fabricated illusion, that real, undeniable strength often comes with a few highly visible scars, and that the true, absolute value of a man is absolutely never determined by the brand of his coat or the logo on his car, but by the undeniable, massive weight of his actions when the water is rising rapidly and the freezing cold finally sets in. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you so incredibly much for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing and your time means the world to me. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this absolute end. This not only helps more people naturally discover this incredibly important story, but also lets me deeply know that my painful experiences truly mean something to someone out there. Your continued, wonderful support is the absolute greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. If this entire grueling, incredibly painful experience has taught me absolutely anything, it is that you should never, under any circumstances, shrink yourself or hide your true, authentic success just to make insecure, highly arrogant people feel more comfortable in their own miserable, petty lives. Real, genuine family does not demand that you destroy your own pride, hide your accomplishments, or tolerate endless abuse just to sit at their table. You deserve respect simply for who you are. Have you ever faced something similar with your own highly toxic family members or deeply arrogant in-laws? Have you ever had to hide your true self just to keep the peace? Share your powerful story in the comments below, and don't forget to absolutely hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.